We have in the studio Mr. Dengiyefa Angalapu. He is a research analyst with the Center for Democracy and Development. Also, we will be joined via Zoom from Lagos, the Deputy Director of Socio-Economic Rights and Accountability Project, that's the Serap, Kolawole Oluwadare. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Nigeria. It's good to be here.
Of course, it's good to have you. All right, let's start with you in the studio, Mr. Angalapu. Based on exactly what is happening with the current, debt rate, should I say, the speed that has grown in every state. Let's even relate it to your state. What is your take on, exactly what is happening?
So, sincerely speaking, I think that it is quite a worrisome situation. And I will bring this to bear, and thanks to the callers, they made very, very informed calls and decisions concerning all of the debt issues that we have. Some analysts will say debt itself is not a bad thing, that states must definitely borrow to finance some projects and all of that. That's the argument. But looking at it critically, the critical ingredients in this discourse is simply, one, the issue of fiscal responsibility. Second is the issue of oversight. And third is the issue of even the priority areas that these debt are used for. So once you begin to interrogate that, you realize that it becomes very, 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 very worrisome, especially because we now have a situation where people are basically, and governors are borrowing, knowing that they will not be the one to pay this debt. They are simply borrowing for the next administration. So I think it's really, 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 really worrisome. More worrisome is the fact that the way we are borrowing is not the way we are generating revenue. So I think that is a very, very fundamental issue. So I think it's a very, very big and challenging problem. Another part of the issue also is the fact that some of these debts come with lots of conditionalities and agreements that the Nigerian people and even the state people do not have knowledge about. So you just see that these debts are approved by the National Assembly and all of that through some processes that are not very transparent. They are approved, and we don't seem to know the conditionalities that comes with these debts. So I think it's a very challenging problem.
Yeah. If we can bring Mr. Kolawole from Serap into the conversation. Your organization has been the one updating Nigerians on some of these suits that you keep initiating from the Buhari administration. I think you hold the record for the most litigations filed regarding some of the secrecy attached to some of these loans, especially at the federal level. What do you make of the situation with the subnationals? Because much of it continues to happen under the radar, so much so that people don't even know what's going on. Recently, we heard from the Kaduna State Governor, who is pretty much indicting the past administration for shackling the future opportunities of the state by, incurring such huge debts, even though he was in support of those loans in the first place. Give us an overview of where Serap stands with regards to the debt burden of the subnationals.
Thank you very much. Of course, this is not surprising. As worrisome as it is not surprising. The states are simply taking a cue from the federal government, who also have penchant, much more than the states, actually, take loans. And to be so opaque with the nature of the loans and then the use of the loans. And so this issue, from Serap's point of view, borders on transparency and accountability. Of course, the economic side of things. It is not enough that government publish details of loans like the Nigerian government has done from time to time through the debt management office. We see details of Nigerians' public debt, both external and domestic, and we see also details of state government bonds. But that is not enough. Nigeria also have a right to know the various issues, including negotiations that are to the loans, the terms of loans, and even the use of such loans. And that means that Nigerians will be fully driver's seat in terms of information to know that our state has borrowed XYZ amount from this administration. And despite the freedom of information request that was sent to all the state governors, including the Minister of the it's just simple. We are simply asking the question that all Nigerians will be interested in. How much, we know how much has been borrowed. How have those loans been utilized over the years? For which projects have they been spent? What status and location of those projects, including the beneficiaries and even the companies involved in these projects? That is what Nigerians need to know to ensure these funds do not end up in private pockets. Because if Nigerians have access to how much states have borrowed at the national level, but we cannot see it translating to anything meaningful in terms of infrastructure, social development. Literally, there is a gap. And Nigerians need to know to be sure that these funds do not end up in private pockets. That is also in time with the provisions of the law, particularly Fiscal Responsibility Act, that place a burden on behalf of the federal state government who want to borrow funds to ensure that there is a cost benefit analysis for any borrowing and that the borrowing must be for social development. In this instance, and Nigerians really confidently say that loans are justifiable in the way they've been spent. I do not think so, particularly in the absence of details of how these funds have been spent. We're also privy to the FAC allocations that have gone in and risen over time. Just last month, the details of FAC allocations were published. There is no indication on ground that these huge sums are. We'll always have people talking about the huge debt burden. Much more importantly, details of this must be public, and it empowers the people to participate in governance. Really.
Yeah, and in talking about the scale of this particular practice, right? You talk about the states taking a page from the book of the federal government. Give me an understanding of where the state's fiscal transparency and accountability as well as sustainability initiative is doing to address some of these gaps, because the World Bank, through this initiative, is trying to incentivize transparency and accountability by even giving these states funds for being accountable, by essentially giving them a prize for trying to be open with their books. Do you think that we're seeing a shift in states being more open about the records, what they're doing with some of these funds after it has hit their accounts?
For any kind of measurement, monitoring and evaluation, it's very important we have a baseline. So the baseline in this instance will be where we Nigerians to be, perhaps just post 1999, or where we are today. But what much more important would be to look at where we were before the SIF program of the World Bank came on board and where we are. Ironically, isn't it strange that the World Bank and the international organization would have to give states incentive for them to disclose their financial position to the same people who voted them in? That's something of a paradox. And I find it strange. The World Bank would have to incentivize state governments to keep their books open, including budgetary processes, income and expenditure to the Nigerian people, which is an obligation that they owe Nigerian people by virtue of the constitution and the mandate brought them into office. So, putting that on one side, the TINS program has so far made some of the states more open approach to budgetary processes and to their budget. More and more states are having their budget in the public domain, but that is not. We must go down to details of expenditure, public procurement, borrowings, the cost benefit analysis, and adherence to the rule of law in the way these are spent. That is where we are yet to be. Or to reach the states, perhaps on the we will reach scales 2/10 in matters of transparency and accountability as concerns governments.
Indeed.
2/10 is quite a low ranking.
It is. So let's come back to the studio. I want to hear your take on, this reoccurrence situation. This thing has been going on for the longest time, and it seems we keep going in circle, collecting these loans, increasing the debt rate of every state, and still the people don't even feel the impact of all of this money being pumped into their states. So what do you think is the key factor, to these issues keep happening over and over again?
Quite an interesting question. I really think that if we want to dissect these issues very well, you will need to look at the times when borrowing becomes more recurrent. And if you look at it properly, it becomes more recurrent during the end of a tenure and then the beginning of another tenure. I think that especially for us at the Center for Democracy and Development, and being somebody that has closely observed the Nigerian political system, very close to the end of the tenure is when you have elections. I know in Nigeria, one of the biggest challenge we have is the challenge of monitoring political party financing. So you want to ask yourself sometimes where those monies go to. Well, you might want to make your findings and see. Then, when a new government comes to power, do not forget that a lot of money has been expended, especially on issues of vote buying, which is common knowledge. You know, in the last election, there are places where vote buying was as high as 20,000 naira. Imagine paying that amount of money to several persons. Why won't the state be broke? So it means that, you know, when you come into power, by whatever means, by whatever justification, you want to borrow to ensure that, you know, you start up the government, because in actual terms, the government is broke. And then the second area is, what is the money being used for? You know, in Nigeria, we tend to borrow to finance, you know, consumer-based products. Instead of, because in the actual sense, we have what they call smart borrowing. So you borrow and you allow whatever you have financed, you know, to pay back the debt. But in situations where you borrow and then basically build an airport, you know, in a place where you just have close cities, perhaps like Ogun and Abuja, like in the next 1 hour, 30 minutes, you can be in the Abuja airport. You also want to build your airport and then inflate the price. You know, inflate the prices to astronomically very, very high. You know, that is particularly a problem. When there are issues, fundamental issues about food, shelter, and then clothing that people want, you simply borrow to fund white elephant projects, places where you can conveniently, make the procurement processes so obscure and, you know, unknown and very difficult to investigate. The third reason is, particularly the reason of accountability. More like the National Assembly that we have, the state assemblies are also, you know, appendages of the executive arm of government. So you will see that some decisions that are very or that are of utmost importance to the people will take so much time in the National Assembly. But the way this borrowing and this loan proposals are passed in the National Assembly is quite shocking. Sometimes 2 days, 3 days they are passed, and without even an effective public hearing processes. So it's a fundamental challenge. I would think that, you know, and I have this view, and, you know, quite a view that, you know, perhaps many people will not agree with. But I have made a proposition that every single government that borrows should pay the amount of money it has borrowed before the end of its tenure. Right. Don't borrow for another administration to pay. So you borrow and then you pay that amount of money. Ensure that you pay it, you know, before you leave that particular place. Because it is simply wickedness for a father to borrow for his unborn children to come and pay.
In this particular instance, I think to give it the proper context would be to say unborn grandchildren, because the debt stock is quite astronomical. But just to bring back Kolawole back into the conversation, you talked about improved FAC allocation. We've seen 5, 7, 10, 15% increment. We've been showing some of the graphics. Since the removal of fuel subsidy, the states have been getting more and more funds. But that has not deterred them to ask for more money by borrowing domestically and some of them at the international level. In fact, the Debt Management Office said in the first 6 months after taking office, 13 new governors across the Federation collectively borrowed the sum of 226.8 billion naira. And according to their report, it also showed that 16 state governors also increased the debt profile of their states by 509 billion. I mean, we know that resources are limited. We know that we're dealing with all-time high inflation, and the economic slowdown itself is impacting negatively on the ability of the government to stay afloat. But give me your understanding of how easy, Angalapu was just shedding light on how easy it is for these states to access some of these loans, because they more or less have a rubber stamp legislature that would be more than happy to approve those loans for them. But when it comes to institutions like the Debt Management Office, for instance, and other institutions that we have within the structure, do you think we need to put a lot more stringent measures in place that would discourage quote unquote, easy borrowing by some of these state governors who do not care about what comes next as long as they get the money to spend on whatever it is they need for today.
Thank you very much. It is less of new legal frameworks and more of, perhaps for lack of a better word, call it political will. This is simply taking a cue from the federal government. And that is why there is a lack of that legal, perhaps moral authority on the part of the federal government to call the states to order. So Fiscal Responsibility Act is there. It applies both to the states and the government. They are laying down criteria for to assess loans, the payment plans, and all prerequisites for getting loans. But the federal government has consistently shown to be an avid body without any kind of mechanisms that make transparent and accountable, and making itself all subject to any kind of accountability processes. The National Assembly or civil society organization or even the public, what do you expect the states to do? It means that if we have new laws, the Fiscal Responsibility Act is amended, we have new laws that will perhaps limit the borrowing powers of the state if they are not enforced and applied. It would be the same thing. So it is not about looking for new legal frameworks. It is that government setting the standard and obeying the rule of law and ensuring that it sets that precedent. Nature, but for context, if you look at the website of the Debt Management Office, the federal government is still the major one by more than 54% total debt stock of Nigeria, both external and external. What do you expect? It's not the federal government, both on the part of the executive and legislature, ever prevail on the state to do the right thing in this instance. I don't see that big.
And Mr. Angalapu, if we talk about those frameworks and the lack of political will, for instance, do you think it is something the governors see as a source of concern because they have their own, analysis that tells them that this is within, the threshold of debt to GDP, so we're still okay? We've heard that multiple times under the Oluwadare administration from the Minister of Finance. Say, listen, as far as the international standard is concerned, our debt to GDP ratio is still okay. There's no problem. We're only worried about, something that's not going to happen. And we need these monies to finance our infrastructural development and so on and so forth. And there's nothing inherently wrong in borrowing as long as it is well targeted. Give me your understanding of what you think is happening at the states. Because for a state like Benue State, for instance, right, we know before Governor Hassan Ali came into power that under Governor Otom, the state workers and local government employees have gone close to a year without getting paid their salaries. How do you explain, that with all of the debts that have been incurred and then some of your recurrent expenditure like salaries and entitlements, for instance, are still not being paid, pensions are still being owed, making the people scratch their head and wonder, like, why does it appear we have all these monies to invest in our state, but we're still unable to see, the dividends of these loans?
Well, I think it's not difficult to see, and this debt to GDP ratio thing, it's one thing that I find very, very, very dissatisfied in this analysis when we talk about loan and debt management, because I would prefer a debt to revenue analysis, really, not a debt to GDP analysis. But I mean, leaving that aside, if you look at all of the states, one thing that is now missing, one thing that is now missing in the state is it's how the anti-corruption agencies are able to work. In the past, state governors were still a bit afraid. You might call it witch hunting if you want. Was a bit afraid that if I leave this particular position, I will need to be explaining, lots of making a lot of explanation to the EFCC or the ICPC. So they were a bit very careful. So you see that when they want to leave a particular position, those in opposition parties, switch on to the main political party just to have that kind of covering. So the whole idea is that what has failed really is the accountability processes. So we are borrowing, and it's more like fetching water, and then putting it in a basket. So there are several leakages several leakages in those states really. So how can you tell me that you borrowed for agriculture? For example, in Bayelsa there were so many borrowings to establish a plastic industry. Where is the plastic industry? So the idea is that if you have borrowed for something, we should see the result. But we've not seen the money, we've not seen the result. And yet this money will be paid for. It is not like they are free money. These monies are, and the annoying part is that you have the option not to pay, right? So you can renegotiate and negotiate to the out of government, and then some other person comes in, and it keeps piling up. So it is not a sustainable way of doing things really, and that has all of the issues of unemployment. So when you borrow to an extent where it gets to a particular stage, you see state government saying we have placed embargo on employment, based off the fact that they will say the revenue is not enough, or fine, we want to retrench and see how we can downsize the civil service, because why? They feel that the income is not enough. I think it is time for us to look inwards and say, fine, rather than borrowing from the outside, let us look at what we can even generate. It's a very, very common statement that contentment is virtue. So we should begin to look inwards and see what we can generate. Nigeria is blessed with several resources in several areas. Why not look at how we can generate? Because if you make state government, if you make governance about borrowing and distribution of borrowed funds, I think it's really easy. We don't need to have all of the campaigns and sophisticated manifestos to just to go and borrow and then distribute. Because I really think that with your basic certificate, anybody can just borrow and distribute money. Mm-hmm. We are thinking of how to generate funding, sufficient funding that will go around, because I really think that we are getting to a point where even when we have the right leadership, it will be difficult for the right leadership, to do any meaningful job, because the government has borrowed to an extent where, there is little or nothing left, to fund developmental needs of the people.
It's literally looking that way. When everybody keeps echoing production and all of that we need to produce, it seems these people are shying away from that because it comes with a lot of work, and they would just prefer to take the easy route in that situation. But then let's go back to Kolawole of Serap. Now Serap is known to be this organization for accountability and transparency, always pushing for that. So if you notice, Nigerians are not really keen on the subnational levels, and this has definitely brought us to this particular position. The people that are supposed to hold these governors accountable at the State Assembly, which based on exactly where we are, shows that they're not really doing what should be done. So boiling back to Nigeria, Nigerians need to focus on exactly the people that they should hold accountable. Would you say, or what would you tell an average Nigerian? How can they be able to hold these governors accountable when it comes to, especially, of course, the responsible financial management?
Thank you very much. I think the approach would be to remove the impediments to that civic education. The Nigerians are educated in all manners of ways. They are socially conscious, but a long history of our politics and governance has brought up several distractions, and I think I can kind of list them: three: politics, tribe and religion. And so that means that when Nigerians look at issues of governance, they are likely to look at it from these three prisons. It's politics and tribe and religion, and that severely undermines the ability of an average Nigerian to engage in governance. So it is about the tribe, the governor, or the members of the National Assembly, or perhaps it's about the composition of the House of Assembly, whether they belong to a political party or what. And the issue of religion also comes into play. If Nigerians can do away with these three issues, it means that we can engage in governance, and also engaging in governance also especially means that we're educated and informed on issues, which is why I think what your organization is fantastic. Having this kind of conversations means that Nigerians are more aware of the issue, they understand the legal framework, the economic perspective, and more importantly, the human angle that they are going through themselves, and they hold those in government ones. I think it is very important as part of what we all do, media and organizations, that Nigerians are empowered to make in governance beyond those rather peculiar issues of tribe, religion, or politics.
And in talking about where we are right now, clearly the finances are not looking particularly good from federal and state. And while government would like us to believe that inflation has a lot to do with why these improved federal allocations are not enough, because as far as infrastructure is concerned, still the dollar plays a significant role in the expenditure. Give me an understanding as to how some have said the issue, the bone of contention here is our budgetary process itself, because more often than not, we see governments using back doors outside of the appropriated funds to access some of these loans without following the due process. And at the end of the day, the burden is still on the state government regardless. It's not tied to any governor as a person, but it's tied to the government as long as those loans are concerned. And when it comes to also debt servicing, we're seeing more now from some of these states where they're unable to have the latitude to operate with the available resources to them because of these huge debt servicing figures.
So what I call malfeasance in government has gone on in Nigeria for so long that appears to be the norm, which is why conversations like these aid to educate the people to understand what and then against what could be. So for context, the budgetary process is simple really in terms of the practical basis. It means that the various agencies, and I'm talking at the subnational level now, but again, what happens at the subnational is significant. What happens at the federal level? It means that the NDAs on behalf of the city collate the estimates of eligible income of each ministry and agency at state level, which is presented to the governor, who presents it to the House of Assembly in form of the appropriation bill for the state. And then the state of Assembly asks us literally to look at the bill and help us to, at a committee stage, to invite the various ministries, government and agencies to take us into it. Why? They ought to mean X, Y, Z amount of money. And that process also needs the people's attention. And don't forget, a member of the assembly is representing a particular community state. And so there ought to be hearings where people weigh also some various aspects of the budget, including performance of the MTAs, as to whether they should get some autonomy. It is part of this process in committee level and then at the main plenary that eventually form the purpose of the budget, which is passed, that the governor assents to as a appropriation law for a particular state. But in practice, these really happen because the little gimmicks and the malfeasance that have come before too long, particularly at that is happening at the state. These are passed sometimes in record time of less than a week. And that means that all these processes are signed. It simply means that the executive can present what they want to the state of assembly, and that the assembly issues of money that we see happening in the assembly can also be rolled out. The assembly can also inflate in some projects in the budget and then becomes passed.
Yeah.
So at the budget level, question and accountability and citizen involvement. How much more when the budget is implemented with procurement and that's another story altogether.
Yeah.
Ultimately, Nigerian victims and really the other point.
Sounds like we need a more robust and up and doing legislature at state and at federal level. Just before we let you go, Mr. Kolawole, because we're running out of time, Serap secured this landmark judgment that for most Nigerians, they consider this a moral victory in light of what many Nigerians are having to deal with right now because of the current economic climate. The idea of these life pensions for governors, ex-governors rather, and deputy governors. For the most part, Nigerians have expressed their disdain and disapproval of this. And we've seen over the past couple of weeks, the state legislature in Abia State, repeal that particular law. Do you think that this particular move is gaining traction across all the states that have these laws put in place, not just because the resources are limited, but because it feels morally wrong to pay someone who was in power for 4 or 8 years lifetime pension in hundreds of thousands of naira?
We need to attribute this move, and this is not the first time. We've seen a legislation that come out some years ago under the Buhari administration to say that it will cut those provisions by 50%. And we've seen states, and Edo State, if I recall correctly, have also repealed the law before now. And I attribute this to the advocacy by Nigerian citizens, various citizens groups, including organizations like Serap, but particularly the citizens who have come out to speak openly against this. I do not think that this is because of lack of funds. It is simply because we're becoming more aware and they are getting what these changes to happen. When you need your pension laws, it is wrong in every way you look at it. It is wrong in terms of legal framework, it conflicts with constitutional provisions, morally, economically, it's not justifiable. It's sustainable. It has to be written to the president to ensure that he obeys the judgment of the Serap Court and the Federal Court in 2019 to ensure that the federal level states and this practice is continuing. It's just a drain on the resources of Nigeria. Hopefully, the government, the president would listen to Serap's in this instance, and we do not have to get it in some sort of contempt to the benefit of Nigerians.
Well, if you do, I guess it will not surprise anyone because Serap is not afraid of heading to the courts to seek redress on this and many other matters. But we're going to have to end the conversation here, I believe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kolawole Oluwadare, the Deputy Director of Serap. Appreciate you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right, coming back to the studio, lastly, I have a question for you, Mr. Angalapu, before we leave. People have been calling for, the federal government to act and play a role in, of course, promoting the fiscal discipline in the states. Do you agree with that?
Well, the Deputy Director of Serap has laid that to bear. He has discussed that. First, if you want to do that, you have to lead by example. So it is not really about, going to tell the states about fiscal responsibility. How responsible are you, in terms of what you've done? That's the fundamental thing. It has been stated obviously here that the states are taking a cue from the federal government. So really, leadership should begin from the top, and it's very, very important that, we put that in place. And also for this to end, we need to understand that there is a need for oversight. Oversight by the Auditor General Office, the EFCC, the ICPC, and then the biggest oversight by the Nigerian people and the National Assembly, really, to ensure that we understand that these loans are not free gifts, these loans are not just given, these loans are not even borrowed for by the governors, or it is not basically their responsibility per se. It is the responsibility of all Nigerians and all of the people in the state, really, because these loans are a collective, just putting us in collective bondage if we are not able to, pay back. And once we realize that, we'll become more interested in the loan processes, in the approval processes, and even in implementation in terms of whatever those loans are used for, we'll become more interested. And once Nigerians are become more interested in those processes, it will be very, very difficult for those loans to be used for something, different from what they were.
Thank you so much, Dengiyefa Angalapu, for joining us to dissect this issue, research analyst with the Center for Democracy and Development. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And with that, we've come to the end of this discussion for today.